Welcome to our education research series. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people and that you can use in your shelter. Our guests today are Greg Miller, a Senior Director of Research in the Strategy and Research Department of the ASPCA, and Debra Olmedo, a Foster and Community Outreach and Medical Care Senior Manager at the ASPCA in Los Angeles. Today, they'll talk to us about their recent research on identifying ways to increase awareness and engagement in kitten fostering programs, especially among residents in areas where the shelter have high intake of kittens. So let's welcome them to learn more.
Hello, everyone. My name is Debra. As I was nicely introduced, I am the Community Engagement and Medical Care Senior Manager at the ASPCA, and I am joined today by Greg Miller, Senior Director of Research. Today, we will be sharing a little bit of some of the findings that we did. But before we begin, I do want to take some time just to acknowledge that we are merely two people of the many people that helped create this project and research paper. So let's get started. Something that we realized was actually that data was telling us that there are certain areas surrounding care centers where we just had this higher increase of kittens coming in. And when we compared those areas with the current homes our foster carers were living in the different areas, they simply were not matching up. We had a significant less amount of caregivers or participants in our foster care program that were actually in those areas. So we really wanted to find out why that was. Another study that happened in Canada in 2021 really noted that there was a kind of shift of moving kittens from more vulnerable to less vulnerable locations. So what was happening there? Why are we not really successful at recruiting fosters from these high kitten intake locations? And how can we increase this participation there? Up until this point, I do want to note that our recruitment process really was composed of looking at ASPCA donor or member lists and events like maybe CatCon or partnering with influencers like Kitten Lady. So our goal for this project, research project, was really to find ways that we can increase awareness and engagement in kitten programs among residents of high kitten intake areas, specifically in LA County. So some of the questions that we really wanted to know was, is the community even aware of kitten foster programs or overpopulation issues? Is there any interest in the community to work with animal rescue groups? If you guys can hear my cat, I apologize, he's well, just really wants to be on my lap. An additional question was what concerns there might be about fostering kittens, if any, and is the community able to meet common foster requirements? What messages and communication methods work best or maybe would be more effective within this community? And we also wanted to know specifically if the answers to these questions vary depending on the demographics, because we really believe that could be a really important factor in shaping how we approach and how we address barriers to fostering and maybe provide suggestions on how to best engage residents in these areas. So I'm going to hand it over to Greg so he can actually talk about our findings.
Thanks, Debra, and thanks for having us. I'd love to first give you a little sense of the methods we used to talk to the group of folks, and so then we'll dig into the findings, and then Debra can hop back in and share some of the opportunities we've taken since learning this in our research. So we conducted a survey, and this was way back in the summer of 2021, so it's been a little bit, but still super relevant to our work, and I think probably really relevant to all of you that are joining us today. And what we did to decide, where to survey was to look for the high kitten intake locations, right? Where Debra was saying we had this mismatch we knew about, but like as far as where to conduct the survey, we looked at high intake zip codes for the Downey and Baldwin Park care centers, and those are part of the Los Angeles County Department of Animal Care and Control. That's 2 of their locations. And we identified the 12 highest kitten intake zip codes over a 1-year period. And then in the map, you can also see under the layer that's there is showing median household income. So those lighter colored, which is underneath the light colors, not the dark green, are the lower income areas, which also is often, in this case, where the higher intake is. And so those are the zip codes that we decided to survey. And what we used for the list of contacts was our clients from the ASPCA. So we have quite a few current and former clients from these areas that we have contact information for. And so we use text messaging. We said, I think it was up to 3 follow-ups to get the sufficient responses. And I'll talk a bit more about who we got responses from here shortly. We used an incentive of an Amazon gift card raffle, I believe it was Amazon, to help solicit more responses. And I think we had a nice return. And the English and Spanish were the 2 language versions that we put together, knowing that matches up with the staff that the ASPCA has and has been able to interact with those clients in the past. I'd like to talk next, Deborah, if we could go to the next slide, about the demographics of the participants. So in that time period, that 1 to 2 month that we were collecting data, we got 283 total responses. There was a link in the text message, right, that opened up to an online survey that they completed. Those that completed the demographics, so the demographics were optional, and at the end, that was 56% of the folks, so about 159 respondents completed these demographics. 74% of the surveys were completed the English language version. The other 26% completed the Spanish. You can see here too that we had a mix of folks that spoke only English at home, those that spoke English and Spanish, and some that only spoke Spanish. And then of those, again, that completed the demographics, they were predominantly identified as women, Hispanic, Latinx. They had incomes, more than half had incomes below $50,000 per year. And almost all had a pet, which isn't surprising since we were surveying our former and current clients. On the next slide, I'm going to talk just about the survey itself, right? So in the survey, we early on laid out a definition for fostering kittens. So they would refer back to the idea of temporarily caring for orphan kittens in your home who are not yet ready for adoption, leaving it that general definition as the starting point of our survey. We also included different pictures to let them know what we meant when we were talking about kittens versus adult cats, because we were talking about outdoor cats. And then on the right, you can see we gave examples of when we were talking about bottle feeding kittens versus hand feeding versus plated food. That's just some examples from what was in our survey. We provided those as references. Our survey was a little bit, it wasn't super short. The median time to complete it was around 9 minutes. So most folks finished it between 5 and 15 minutes. So not super short either. But we did receive almost the 300 responses, and we feel like that was a really good response rate for the type of survey. And we've really got some good information that now we'll dig into, starting with the next slide, please, Debra. So as Debra mentioned, we really had kind of 5 categories of information we were hoping to learn about. So it was really this first one, awareness, as well as interests, concerns, ability to participate in these programs, and then finally marketing. So I'm going to cover all of those in the next few slides and just share some highlights of our findings. I really encourage you to also dig into the paper if you get a chance to learn about some other specifics, but I think these are kind of our key findings that we wanted to work through. First, about awareness and their experiences with fostering. Of all our respondents, only 3%, so very few, had participated in fostering with a program, right? And we knew that for the most part, folks in these high intake zip codes weren't participating in the ASPCA foster program, certainly not at high levels yet. So that isn't a completely surprising, but a very low number, thinking that these are previous or current ASPCA clients, and a pretty low percentage here have participated with a shelter program. But 26% indicated that they have been fostering in some form on their own without support from the program. So that leads us to like, well, what is that? What does that mean? And we asked further about, so in the community, who's taking care of kittens? From everything from no one, or they're ending up at the shelter, to I'm taking care of them, or my neighbor's taking care of them. And so what they indicated in their responses was really that more than half of the respondents felt like those outdoor cats and kittens were being taken care of either by themselves or others they knew in the community. So there is fostering or care for these cats that they felt strongly was already happening in their community. So that was, I think, a really important learning. We didn't know how folks perceived that in these high intake areas. And so we learned that through this survey. On the next slide, I want to talk more about gauging the interest of folks. So here at the top, we're really talking about those who completed the survey. A third of them indicated they'd be interested in fostering in partnership with a shelter or rescue. And of those who had fostered on their own, right, that 26% from the prior slide, 2/3 of those folks were interested. So that's a lot from this survey of this area. And maybe the next bullets here really highlight, some of the misses so far, right? So like that awareness level is really low about opportunities to engage with the shelter or rescue foster program. They haven't even seen the advertising, right? There hasn't been materials made available to them that they have seen or accessed. And if they're Spanish speakers, or certainly in our survey, if they filled out the Spanish language version of the survey, they were even less likely to have seen those foster program promo materials. Only 5% of those respondents had indicated they had seen any at all. And then when we think about, so I wanted to give you another sense about the survey itself. So when we asked about concerns, and then the other piece about their ability to participate in like kind of typical fostering program and meeting those requirements, we use different scales, right? So for concerns, we used, 1 to 5, extremely worried to not worried at all, about different topics. And those topics ranged from, concern about becoming too attached to the kittens, to it costing too much money, to not having enough space. And you can see that the ones that were most frequently mentioned as a concern for our survey respondents were around time, having enough time, having enough financial concerns, and then having enough space. So those were the ones that bubbled up to the top. Those others that they were offered were not nearly as high, but still concerns that added to the information we've gathered. And then when we talked about the ability to meet kind of these program requirements, we use this scale of 1 to 4. Never able to meet those requirements, or always able to meet, and then in between there. And that's how we arrived at this last highlight here around. So the average person who did indicate that they were interested in fostering, so remember that high percentage from the earlier slide, or pretty high percentage, 1/3 were interested in fostering, they could meet 5 to 7 out of the 10 requirements. And those requirements were really about, being able to commit the time, being able to do the daily care, being able to transport, being able to communicate with the foster team, all those a lot of the typical requirements that you see in typical kitten fostering programs. And then those that indicated they weren't open to fostering, not surprisingly, were said that they really couldn't meet many of those requirements at all, maybe 1 or 2. So there's maybe the interest relates to the barriers, so like thinking that through as well. But those that were interested could meet a pretty high number of the requirements, but not all of them. So that's important to keep in mind. And then a little bit more on this next slide. This is again about the ability and really reframing that. So if they're not able to meet all the requirements, does that really mean that there are in many cases already fostering in their community, just not with the program? But are there other ways, thinking of the assets of the community themselves, what they're already doing, what they're saying they can do, addressing some of their concerns, what are ways that they could contribute? And they indicated in the survey, promoting, sharing about adoptable kittens with their friends and family and in their neighborhoods is something that they're up for. They have the ability to contribute to. And even the different, feeding different age needs for the kittens when it comes to feeding and daily care, pretty high percentage said that that's ways that they do feel like they could contribute. On the flip side, some of those kind of other pieces that were more seen as obstacles, at least in the responses, were really something that we have as a standard practice, I think, with our ASPCA foster program, or at least one key mechanism for training and orientation is that online component, right? The online training. And in this survey, 62% saw that as an obstacle, as actually a challenge. The ability that they didn't feel like they had right now would be able to use that mechanism to become part of a program. So thinking through maybe alternatives to that. Also, the longer term care for the kittens, the 1 week to 1 month, not the shorter time frames, there were more concerns and obstacles around that, being able to meet those abilities. And then finally, I was mentioning the kind of the fifth area was we tested out, it's not on this slide, but there are two components to this. We asked about forms of communication, but we also tested out some actual marketing messages. We picked 5 sample messages that really had different themes, right? Like some that were centered on animal welfare itself, right? Like the survival of the kittens. Others that were more about, that the costs would be absorbed by the foster program, or that you would always have access to a helpline, kind of trying to address what maybe the concerns are in the promotional marketing statements. And really what came back as the folks connected most with and said that they would probably most motivated by really was the survival of the kittens. It was about the individual kittens and cat welfare. So that was something we found. And then we also asked, what are the preferred methods of communication? What would be most effective for them in communicating, having communication come from a shelter rescue fostering program? And we asked for their top 3. So these numbers don't add up to 100%. Everybody picked up to 3. And not surprisingly, we solicited our responses via text. So text appeared pretty high, but email and social media just as frequently selected. Other options that weren't selected very often were, like even the idea of having a celebrity advertisement or relying on radio or friends and family to get your information. Those weren't selected as highly. Did point out here within the social media category that scored way lower when split by demographics, both for over 55 in our responses and Spanish speaking. That might be a less effective method. But that would probably need to be digged into a little bit more too, to be fully confident in that. But just some more food for thought about what barriers or what other avenues of communication might be more effective for some communities that haven't been as engaged in the kitten fostering programs formally with shelters and rescues. So Debra, I think I'm going to hand it back to you, right? So that you can talk a little bit. Oh, this is the limitations piece. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So obviously I mentioned as I was going through that, there are limitations to our survey and this paper in the sense that we were limited to ASPCA clients. So we used clients that we already had contact information for. We used text messaging, and really we only surveyed pet owners because those were the client base that we had. We didn't reach, since we primarily we used English and Spanish language versions, and we only surveyed within these 12. These aren't the only high kitten intake zip codes, but we only surveyed in these 12. So we're definitely limited. We know that there are some, for example, in areas we work in within these zip codes, other languages that we would love to have surveyed, and in the future we would probably try to address that better, specifically Asian languages. Vietnamese, Cantonese, and Mandarin are pretty predominant in some of those zip codes, and we would have loved to collect more on that. So there are limitations in that way. And also just, I think it would be, if our survey hadn't already been the length it was, we would have loved to ask more about like housing and employment scenarios for folks, to see how much those maybe influence some of the concerns and abilities that they did share with us. So, and I think this kind of really does feed into a lot of what Debra, I think you're going to share about the opportunities that we've identified via this research, and how that's played out in some of the programming that you've been involved with, especially in LA.
Yeah, and the big opportunity that we really saw is that by using community-informed strategies to really engage and retain Latinx individuals in fostering efforts, we're really expanding the amount of kitten volunteers in our program. There's been, I think, a little bit of a myth that only a certain demographic of people are willing or able to foster kittens. And the reality is that there are a lot of people already within the community, underserved communities really, that are already caring for kittens, cats, chickens, you name it, they're helping. And they're doing it without any support from animal welfare organizations. So really, we are leaving out a big group of people that already has interest and is already doing the work. So by including them, we really are just multiplying the amount of people that are willing to help, and therefore we're just multiplying the amount of kittens that we're able to help. This approach is also really improving the sustainability of animal welfare groups. Right now, we're removing kittens from communities and we're kind of creating a vacuum effect. So we really want to try and keep kittens where they are and also provide spay-neuter opportunities for them. And lastly, no one understands the community needs better than the community itself. So including them really removes a lot of assumptions and really helps us to get to real solutions a lot quicker. So I'd love to share with you some of the things that we're doing in LA already to help include some of our research findings. The first one is our community-based foster program. And what we're really doing with this program and the goal of this program is to work alongside kitten finders to keep the healthy kittens that shouldn't be at care centers out of care centers. And the reason, or excuse me, how we're doing this is by listening. I know that sounds kind of like, what? We are really asking community caregivers or community cat caregivers what they need. There are a lot of people that year after year are caring for kittens, providing homes, providing shelter, and are just amazing finders of homes. Really, I don't know how they do it, and the amount of kittens that they place in homes is really impressive. And the only thing that they really would need or would love support on is just finding spay-neuter resources so that the kittens that they do go out for adoption or they bring up for adoption are already altered. And or also just TNR support for the adults that are continuously breeding. There are other people like Juanita. She was one of the first community members that I worked in with this project. She was a retired Cuban lady and she had a wonderful Cuban accent that I envy. But she was telling me how, when I met her, I was talking to her because I saw that she had a few cats. And she was telling me, every single thing about the cats and how they came to her. And she was telling me about this one little Torby cat that she said, back in the day before she was spayed, that she was a bad mama cat and that she, would just sometimes ignore the kittens. So what she loved to do is get the kittens and she helped supplement, and bottle feed these babies. So I'm sitting there just thinking to myself, like, wait a minute, you're telling me that you actually really enjoy bottle feeding and you're retired and you have the time to do it? And she was like, yes, I'm just sad because I got them all TNR'd, so I don't have access to kittens anymore. And that's when it hit me like, oh my God, like this is like, I just found $1 million. And just coincidentally, around the same time, we were doing a TNR case just down the street from her. And the mama cat went MIA, and I had 2 kittens that needed bottle feeding, and Juanita took them on. And it was like, this is making sense. We're keeping them in the community. I did not have to send them to another LA foster. We were able to also, just add more help, which was amazing. And the other thing that we really started to do is just kind of improve the messaging right, we saw that the two main things that people were a little bit more willing or really would make most influence is just including the cost or there is no cost when you do this, and also just an animal welfare focused messaging as well. We're also improving how we are disseminating information, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about translating materials in the next slide, which is just further discussion. So obviously, providing material in a different language other than English is great. But if you go to Google Translate and you put outdoor cat, it translates it to something very silly. It's gato al aire libre. And that literally means like al fresco cat. That makes absolutely no sense. So I just can imagine like my grandmother trying to read something about an al fresco cat. Like that just doesn't make any sense. So really, we really need to focus on either creating material in the language itself, and if that's not possible, really including native speakers to make sure that the translations that are occurring make sense and are keeping the messaging that we want them to really have. The other thing I learned was that terms that may seem very obvious for you and me, somebody in animal welfare, as common as fostering, may have really different connotations to different people, or simply we don't have a term for that. If there's any Spanish speakers, if you guys could put in chat how you would translate kitten foster. I'm really curious to see if there is a consensus there. And if there is a consensus, I would love for you to explain to my grandmother that lives in Nicaragua what I do for a living, because she is very confused. And I was speaking to this community member, and she was telling me how this mama cat that she has, she always goes and she gives birth in her garage. And then, after a few weeks, she goes out and she parties. That's what she was telling me. And she has to wake up extra early in the morning to make sure that the kittens have clean water and food, and to clean, the little area in the garage. And then, then she worries about them all day. And then when she comes home, the first thing that she does is she goes into the garage to make sure that the kittens have food, shelter, and then are otherwise doing well. So she was one of those people that told me that year after year she finds home, and she was finally in the predicament that she ran out of friends and she didn't know who this last litter of kittens she was going to give to. So she was asking me about adoption opportunities. And I said, yeah, absolutely, I can help with that once they are spay-neuter ready. They're probably around, 6 weeks. I was like, is there any way that you can continue to foster them until they're 8 weeks? And then I can get them altered. And she looked at me, and it was like I had insulted her whole family. Absolutely not. I cannot foster. And I was like, wait, you're already doing that. Like, that is literally what you're doing. You're providing food and support, but the word itself, foster, had a different connotation to them. So really just being mindful of the types of word that you're using, right? In community, cat's also like owned cat. Is it your cat? Oh no, it's not my cat. So just being mindful of terminology. And lastly, in animal welfare, we tend to have little buckets. We have a foster program over here and an adoption program over here. And if at all, maybe a community engagement program. And community engagement is the one that really focuses on outreach and community. But with this finding and the work that we've been doing, we really should consider or start the conversation about what else are we missing out on, right? If we're not centering community engagement in all of the work that we're doing and no longer separated. So yeah, a lot of fun things, and I'm really excited to see, how our work progresses. But I will hand it over to Greg for some interesting opportunities.
Yes, and before we dig into any questions, I did want to highlight that we have some other research-related opportunities that are actually open now that I wanted folks to be aware of if you're not already. And this will be in the shared information afterwards too, but there are QR codes here and you can access the web pages. But the ASPCA AWA Research Forum that's been going on for a few years now is coming up again in the fall, and that's open for abstract submittals for proposals now. And then also we have annual ASPCA research grants. So that RFP is open now. Both of these are open till the end of June. So the research grants, there's categories for access to vet care, behavior, cruelty, and psychological trauma. And Maddie supports the access to vet care grants. Thank you very much. And I wanted to just highlight these opportunities. I'd encourage you to go check them out and share within your networks to those who might be interested. So thank you. And at the research forum, sorry, I should have said that, like there will be probably 4 to 5 presentations there. I think some of the types of learnings we had from this project, you might see similar research building off of those, depending on what kind of proposals we get. So once registration opens, I'd obviously encourage attendance, but if you have research or know others that do, that would be ready for an animal welfare audience by the fall, please have them apply. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. We have a couple of questions. One of them is, what word do you use for foster in Spanish, or is it like a description?
I have asked everyone and anyone that I can think of from back home, and the consensus is that it really changes depending on where you're from. So in Nicaragua, we would say something like hogar temporal, a temporary home. But I have found the most results with just explaining what it is. Are you able to provide care, shelter? And that is really where the listening part of the project really comes into play. Like, what is it that they need? And like Greg said, like, we really focus on what people can't do, but what can they do and how can we supplement that?
I love that. That's great. And then what is the impact of the changes that have been made in LA to recruit the Latinx kitten fosters?
We're finding a lot of, like I said, a lot of these kittens that do not have to go to the shelter. We are keeping them within the community as much as possible. So my specific project is in a city called Del Monte. So we're really trying to find people that are willing to care for the kittens that they're found. Like, let's say I'm doing TNR in one location, this person isn't able to care for the kittens, maybe the neighbor can. And I've had a lot of that where the neighbors were already doing it anyways. They just didn't know they weren't there. People just didn't know that these people existed. And on the reverse side of that, we all know that cat person in our lives, right? So that was already happening. Hey, Debra, I found kittens again. Here you go, kind of a thing. The other really cool thing that I am very excited about is that we are seeing people that, we helped in this community foster aspect of our work that just loves doing it. So if we don't have any Almonte kittens that they can take care of, they've onboarded as an LA foster. So they're also helping us with the work of the shelter cats that we're able to take into our foster program.
Awesome. We have another question. Have you had any experience with Latin or South American community members that are primary Indigenous language speakers in your LA work?
No, I haven't really. The majority of people that I have encountered have been or are proficient, at least in Spanish. I do work with, or I have encountered, I should say, people like Greg had mentioned, there is a big Asian community in El Monte. So what I have done in those circumstances is I have recruited a trapper that is fluent in those languages, and I take that person with me to communicate. So if you are encountering people that are, not Spanish or not a language that I would really suggest having somebody from that language. And even if it's something, like I said, I am from Central America, and talking to somebody from Mexico or South America, sometimes the words just don't make sense. So just keeping in mind that not everything means the same thing to everyone.
Absolutely. You had asked, you had mentioned earlier that taking kittens from one community and adopting them out in another, the vacuum effect is in play there. And I just was wondering if you could tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, so when we talk about TNR, we talk about creating a vacuum effect, right? People have tried to find ways to decrease cat populations. And some people said, hey, let's just go and take all these kittens away. The reality is that the resources are still there. The want of people to care for these kittens is still there. So yes, we are removing those kittens, right? All those kittens that before this project, let's say, were being impounded into the shelter. The resources are still there. The breeding cats are still there. So really, we're just making a nice little home for new cats to fill that void. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and I really see a difference is that TNR aspect that we also are including. Like, obviously, it's fantastic that I'm able to keep the cats out of the shelter, but also they know where the mama cat is. They know who the daddy cat is. They know all their stories, and I hear them all, right? This is the daddy cat, and he goes over here, and he goes over there. So fantastic. We're able to help the kittens, right, that are there right then and there. But also we're able to stop those breeding cycles. So the vacuum effect no longer really is a thing to worry about because we're stopping the breeding from occurring as well.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you both very much. And thanks to all of you for watching today's webcast. Greg and Debra will be available in Maddie's Pet Forum to continue this discussion. Feel free to post more questions there. Thank you, and we will see you next time.